All right, welcome to the For the Love of Language podcast. I'm authentically EJ,
And I'm Stacy the linguist.
and today we are going to talk about grammatical gender, right?
Yes, we are. This is another podcast exclusive, by the way, because Stacy had computer issues, but it's fine. We're here. Grammatical gender. So we all know gender. Gender is the sociological construct of how you present yourself. Traditionally, it is masculine, feminine, and then lately we've had non-binary, neutral, somewhere in between.
Yeah, well, and I would just caveat that a little bit. It's not actually super lately. Like there are really, really old traditions,
True,
like
true.
Two-Spirited and Native American tribes. Lots of cultures around the world have non-binary representation for quite a long time.
Yes. It's only recently that we've called it non-binary, specifically.
Yes.
But yes, so there is this sociological construct of gender, but there's also grammatical gender, in which certain nouns are designated as male or female or neutral. Is typically the three that we find cross linguistically. And then what has to happen is things in that sentence or that are related to that noun have to agree in gender with that noun. So just like we have things like number, right? Like if I have two pencils, I have to use the pencils are sharp. I can't say the pencils is sharp because they have to agree in number, and so I have to use the right verb to agree with that noun. So
Yeah.
similar for gendered language.
And for English speakers, this can be a little bit different, seem a little bit complicated because we don't really use grammatical gender in English. We do have some interesting things with gender, like for example, ships are generally female. We do have like Mother Earth is generally seen as female as well, but that's not we don't actually have gender as part of our grammar. And some
Yeah.
people would argue that grammatical gender is not actually related to the sociocultural concept of gender at all. The truth is, it is sometimes, it isn't others.
It ultimately depends on the culture itself.
Exactly. Yeah. But maybe this would be good to give a few examples of actual grammatical gender being used to help our listeners who are less familiar with the concept and maybe highlight how it's a bit different in different languages.
Yeah, so French is the language that I studied for about 5 years. Am I good at it? Not really. It's okay. You lose practice. But in French is a gendered language. And so you have masculine and feminine. And those are the only two that they use. And for the most part, because like France doesn't have a super gendered society, like it's not like Spanish, which also uses masculine and feminine. But in a lot of Spanish countries, there is like strong patriarchies and stuff, and this idea of machismo, or masculinity. And so in Spanish, that grammatical gender kind of does mean something, because there is like a lot more weight on the concept of gender itself. Whereas, and I hate to make assumptions, so please, if anybody speaks better French than me, correct me if I'm wrong, or is from France, or other French speaking countries. Whereas like France doesn't necessarily have such like heavy ties to gender. Like something can be masculine and feminine, and it doesn't super matter. They're very much more like it is just a grammatical function of our language, rather than like it speaks to like the masculinity or femininity of an object or something, and that matters.
Well, and I've studied Spanish for a very, very long time, and I would say that this is kind of a divisive topic, even among native speakers of Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
So I have had native Spanish speaking teachers who say that, oh, it's just gender. It's not related to, actually being a woman or a man. And then I also had a student in my master's program who was from Spain, and she was very, very adamant about Spanish being too gendered, and she wanted to do her research and like make a difference in this area. So it is one of those polarizing topics
Hmm.
that some people will say one thing and some people will say another, which it's partly reflective of how people have learned grammar over time. It's partly reflective of who people's teachers are, people's worldview. But I think it's safe to say there is definitely some connection in Spanish. And
Hmm.
in a lot of languages that use gender, like I think Stacey already mentioned, you'll have a male and a female. And in some languages, you'll also have a neutral.
Those are usually Germanic languages. German is like numero uno
Right.
to
So, like,
use Spanish.
in Romance languages, it is usually just male and female. In Spanish, the articles would be el for masculine, la for feminine. And in Germanic languages, like in German, you have der, die, das, which is masculine, feminine, neutral. And in most of these languages, if you have a word like the word woman is going to be grammatically female. The word man is going to be grammatically male. And
Mhm.
so a lot of these words that grammatical gender will actually be used to indicate the gender of a person. A lot of the time, you'll also have words like maybe a bit of an antiquated example from English at this point, like actor and actress, where we actually did change the word. We've been moving away from that as a society now, and everyone is pretty much calling themselves actors at this point to get rid of that arbitrary distinction because it's like, how am I different for being a woman? I'm still a freaking actor.
Mhm.
And I shouldn't be viewed any differently because of that. So there's
Mhm.
actually like a linguistic trend in English right now to get rid of a bunch of those distinctions. But in other languages, you might be forced to always have that distinction because of the grammar of the language. Because maybe if your word ends in a consonant, it's male, and if it ends in ah, it's female. And so you have to choose what to use.
Yeah, another example I'm thinking of, one that we're both familiar with, EJ, is the way you say thank you in Portuguese, in Brazilian Portuguese more specifically,
Mm.
because the word is obrigado, but it depends on who is saying it, right? And so because I identify as a female person, I say obrigada, and I use the feminine version because I am the one thanking, and I am female, so I have to use the feminine version. Whereas somebody else who is masculine would say obrigado to say that I am masculine and I am saying thank you. And that
Mhm.
can get kind of tricky if you maybe don't identify as a man or a woman. And I don't know how exactly people are addressing that in
Mhm.
some of those bigger cultures. But there are aspects where you have to choose.
Yeah, and there's actually movements in a lot of these languages right now to introduce a third form. So, one that's taking on in Spanish is actually instead of just an a or an o ending, having an e ending for anything that's neutral, non-binary. In Portuguese, it's a little bit harder because an e or an o or an u ending could all kind of be seen as masculine, so it's harder to find one that could be seen as neutral.
Right.
So while in Spanish, it's actually a relatively simple solution because that's like the only vowel that really would make sense. And there's not anything else using that vowel. So it just works. In Portuguese, it's actually a little bit more complicated. But yeah, there are movements right now to kind of create new words, create new articles to match a new gender for the language, which is kind of interesting and cool. But so those are cases where gender is actually tied to the grammar.
Yes.
But then there's also cases where it's just like you have the word window, and the word window needs to have a gender, and so it has one. And sometimes there's rules based on the phonology of the language. So maybe in Russian, the word for window is okno, and so it's going to be neutral because it ends in o. And you'll have, like in Spanish, if a word ends in a, it's almost definitely feminine, unless, of course, it comes from Greek, like mappa, in which case it's actually going to be masculine. So you have these weird rules that override rules, these patterns that kind of interact with each other. But for the most part, like in Spanish, if it ends in a, it's usually going to be a feminine word, regardless of whether that word or that idea actually has any construct of gender applied to it.
Yeah. I want to take a quick step back and address a question that a lot of our listeners might have, especially those who are native English speakers, and that is why? Why does grammatical gender exist?
Why does it exist, Stacey?
As a linguist, I will tell you some of the hypotheses. Now, like we've said, grammatical gender can have cultural ties, but it can also, just be a way, especially for a lot of English speakers, it seems like just a way of complicating things, right? Like to say that one thing agrees in this one seemingly arbitrary way, like you don't technically need it, right? So is what some people will say, like in English, oh, we don't have gendered language. You don't need gendered language. And to some extent you would be correct. It may not be 100% necessary, but there are a lot of things in language that aren't considered necessary, right? And the beauty about language is that every language has its own level of complexity. And I personally, this is 100% Stacy the linguist's opinion, so don't go around quoting me on, I mean, you can quote me on this because it is my idea, but don't go around citing things and saying that all linguists think this. But I'm of the opinion that all languages have the same amount of inherent complexity. It will just manifest in different ways. So
Yes.
for example, a lot of people say that like Mandarin Chinese is pretty complicated because it's tonal system. But when you look at it, it's complicated in its tonal system, but it's simple in other ways. Same with English. Like English is complicated in some ways and simple in others, right? And it's kind of this give and take. Like where do you choose to put your complexity? Now, as to why we have some of that complexity, a lot of that is to just like encode more meaning into things, supposedly. Again, a lot of this is currently under study, under research, and some of this is just my opinions because we still don't know exactly why this shows up. But this idea of complexity being an inherent part of language is something that a lot of people do assume that languages do
Mhm.
have complexity to help us encode these different meanings.
Kind of to support that, when we were talking about language acquisition, I think we mentioned that, native speakers of different languages all learn their first languages at the same rate, which I think really supports that argument of, the absolute complexity of languages is at least very similar,
Mhm.
but they are complicated in different ways from each other.
Yeah, exactly. And so that complexity allows us to talk about complicated topics like our feelings and the state of the universe and all these other things that have helped humanity grow, you know? And so even though like gendered language, like grammatical gender, we especially English speakers see it as like really complicated or unnecessary, it is an aspect of those languages that helps to add to the linguistic complexity that we need to communicate certain ideas, whether we completely understand that or not.
And sometimes, even though like it might seem superfluous to us, that doesn't mean that there isn't actually, value in communication that comes from these because
Hmm.
maybe you have words that really are similar, and so having different articles between genders might help you separate them more.
Yeah.
There are going to be cases when it actually does contribute to people being able to understand and being able to express themselves more clearly.
Yeah, a good example of this is since we were just talking about your lovely puppies, is the way that people talk about like animals, right? So in
Mm,
English, if we want to talk about a male dog versus a female dog, right? We say that a female dog is a bitch and a male dog is what
a
do you call
dog.
it? It's just a dog. And
Yeah.
there, in breeding areas, I know that they have a specific word
I'm
for a
pretty sure it is
dog.
dog, actually.
Is it?
Yeah.
But
A
we have
cow
a
is a good example where you
cow
have
is a
like a
good example.
heifer or a steer.
Exactly. And so in English, we have completely different words for that. And the complexity, like English has a lot of different phonemes. We have a lot of different sounds that we have access to. So we can create these different words. Whereas, like in French, for example, if you want to talk about dogs, you have le chien and then you have la chienne. The only thing that really changes between the word is the grammatical gender. So in that
Mhm.
case, it's kind of helpful. You don't necessarily have to change, like create a whole new word for dog, if you want to distinguish between a male dog and a female dog, you just need to change the grammatical gender. So in that case, it is a little bit beneficial. And while, it might not always apply to humans, because like we said, gender is like a continuum, in things like animals where, that matters and it's a touch more binary because animals don't have that like sociology between them, it's a little bit more useful.
Yeah, that's a super interesting example, actually. I'm just thinking of like a couple other things that aren't actually super related to that. But, some people will make the argument in German, you have a word for a young woman that is Mädchen. And I'm saying that as someone who lived in Frankfurt with a Hessisch accent. So if you learned German in Berlin or from someone from another area, don't judge me. Hessisch is amazing. But you have das Mädchen, and that is a neutral article being used for a word that's actually for a woman. And it's one of those interesting exceptions because Chen, that Chen ending in German, is actually a suffix that always makes the word neutral. And so even though this word would potentially be female, because you have other patterns in the language influencing it, the pattern of that suffix generally being a specific gender changes the gender of the word. So you'll have all sorts of interesting patterns and things that people will talk about as to like how this is used, how this is defined. But I think the patterns in the language kind of give the language a rhythm and a personality as well, and can be kind of fun to work with. I can go on another kind of tangent with.
Let's go on a tangent. Today is a little bit tangential, and I'm here for it.
Right? It is tangent day. So there's some interesting things with grammatical gender in Spanish. I mentioned how if you have words like mapa that come from, I think, Greek, those will generally end with a but still be masculine. And so that's kind of an interesting thing about words being borrowed into different languages and how languages treat that.
Yeah.
There's interesting things about how that works in different languages as well. Like in Russian, if you have a name that's brought into Russian, even if it has endings that you would normally change based on the role in the sentence, you won't do it a lot of the time if it's a foreign name. So there's interesting rules that can happen in those scenarios. But another interesting one, in English, if we have a as an article, we will change that to be an if the next word phonetically starts with a vowel.
Mm-hmm.
And I say phonetically because you can have like an honest man written, it starts with an H, but it's still phonetically a vowel. And so we use an.
Yes. Yes.
There's similar rules in Spanish when it comes to articles. And so you'll have like the word agua, which is just water in Spanish, and it's a feminine word. But because the word starts with an A, you don't want to say lagua, right? It just become like one word. And so they'll actually say they'll use the masculine article and they'll say el agua for water, even though it's a feminine word. And so they'll actually, that's a broader pattern that is applied whenever you have a Spanish word that starts with a, you'll actually use the masculine article regardless of whether the word itself is actually masculine. But then you'll have adjectives that follow on the word. And so you might have el agua fría. And so that adjective afterwards would still match potentially with an A. And this is one of those areas also where it can get a little bit complicated because you're getting into like patterns upon patterns. And so even native speakers will maybe sometimes change the following adjective differently, and you will see variation in language and whatnot. But that's just like an interesting way in which, gendered articles can actually modify in ways you might not expect.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, you find similar things in French too, where like it doesn't matter if the noun is masculine or feminine. If it begins with a vowel, you just add le in front of it. So you would say, what's a good example? My brain is blanking on the top of my head.
And I don't speak French, so I can't help you. Sorry.
There you go. There you go. But yeah, no, I keep thinking of plural nouns. And for plural nouns, it's a different pattern. But if it's singular and it starts with a vowel, then it's you would prefer to shorten it to, instead of la and le, you just shorten it so it follows the prescribed phonological pattern of like consonant vowel consonant vowel.
So if I'm understanding that correctly, you would leave out the a or the from the article, and it would just be like an L.
Yes, it would just be something,
Mm,
L, and then whatever vowel comes next.
yeah,
Um, if I think of an example in the next couple of minutes, I'll let you know.
no
But I keep thinking of
worries.
like the plural versions of all these nouns. It's
Yeah.
hilarious.
No, that's interesting. We've talked a lot about like how articles and I think adjectives as well can change based on the gender of a noun, but there's actually a lot of different ways that languages can change based on gender. So,
Hmm.
an example of one that treats this a little bit differently is Russian. Russian doesn't have articles. There's no word for a or the in Russian, so that those can't be modified because they don't exist.
Right.
But one of the interesting things that does change in Russian based on gender that doesn't happen in Romance or Germanic languages, at least the ones I'm familiar with, is that past tense singular verbs are gendered. So if a woman were to say, I went to the store, the verb went might be pashla, versus if a man says, I went to the store, the verb went would be pashol. And so and that is a little bit of an interesting example because there's this tendency in languages for the most common verbs like to go or to be the most irregular.
Yes.
And so like the verb to go is actually with that specific there's a lot of complication actually around
Of
movement in
course.
Russian, but for that particular form of the verb to go, it would be paiti. And
Mhm.
so pashol and pashla is what comes from that. But for other verbs, it would be a little bit simpler sounding, but you would generally still have the ah added if a woman is doing something. And that'd be the same if I say if a woman says I went, or if I'm saying a woman went, like that verb would be the same.
Yeah.
And so that's just like an interesting case. Like languages can change all sorts of different parts of their grammar based on gender, based on different things, and like it's really hard to make broad statements about languages and about what is possible because there's so much variation.
There really is. There really is. But it is kind of well known that pretty much every language will agree in number and in tense. So what time something happens and how many things are there when it's happening. And then like we said, there are a few that do have this gender feature. But there are also in a plethora of other languages. I'm thinking like Australian Aboriginal languages and Native American languages. Things will also agree in other aspects too, like depending on your location, like how close or how far you are to
You
something.
could also have formality that could change things.
Exactly like in Japanese, where depending on who you're talking to, you need to change things to reflect like your social status.
There's also like maybe a little bit more niche ones where languages might distinguish between like an inclusive or an exclusive we.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm talking to someone and I'm with a group of people and I'm saying, we're going to go to the store, but I'm saying we're going to go without you. That's going to be a different form than we're going to go with you.
Hmm.
So there's like so many things that could vary, but I think Stacy did point out the main ones that are really common.
Yeah. And again, we don't always know how these things kind of come about, but like when you do consider it, some of these things kind of are like cultural. Like a lot of the Romance languages are gendered and they have like very strong patriarchal societies. And so gender kind of matters in those situations. Whereas in other cultures, gender might not matter so much. And so you don't necessarily have to like encode that grammatically. That's like speaking to like Native American languages that don't necessarily, I think some of them might be gendered, but I think most of them aren't, but they will have an additional complexity of some sort.
Definitely. And like a Finnish is a good example of a language that isn't gendered. Like they don't even
Hmm.
have separate words for he or she. There's just the word han.
Chinese is the same. It has the same singular pronoun. Doesn't matter who you
Right.
are, you use the same.
Yeah, he and she in Chinese is both ta.
Mhm.
And I probably got the tone wrong because tones are not my forte in any way. But it's that same word that's used for both. And in written Chinese, they are distinguished, but in spoken Chinese, they're the same.
Hmm. Exactly. So yeah, I mean that just goes to show like languages will kind of like select where they need their complexity to be based on cultural values, based on like history and stuff, and like things like that are changing. Like when we're talking about gendered languages and using grammatical gender, we talk about how, you know, it's becoming more, we're becoming more socially aware of non-binary people, and so a lot of those gendered languages are having to adapt. And so many of these languages are pushing for a neutral term. And so they might look more like German in the future that does have a neutral gender, as opposed to something like English where we're just like, let's just get rid of grammatical gender entirely.
Right. And you know that does point out an interesting thing. Like if a language does have two genders and if they're actively trying to make a change, there's options, right? They could either add one or they could remove one. And you know, it's probably different languages are going to do different things over time.
Yeah. So it'll be really interesting. And we might not see this in our lifetime. It just depends. The world is moving so quickly these days. Language doesn't change like it used to, at least, you know, at least that we've been able to observe or have down in written record. And so because the world is moving so quickly and languages are changing, it'll be interesting to see which path some of these languages take
Mhm.
in regards to this like social movement of representing non-binary people in like a good way.
Well, and there's also other issues that come into play with that. Even if there is a language that currently has three genders,
Hmm.
sometimes that neutral gender is viewed more as it.
Yeah.
And so it could be seen as dehumanizing someone, even if someone doesn't want to fall into the other two genders. And so you could still have other like complex issues that go into play when someone
Right.
chooses what to use, even if they don't identify as male or female.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, it's a very interesting it's an interesting take overall to see what languages will do. But like we've talked about before, a lot of languages just like especially Native American languages where they have this concept of people who are two-spirit or non-binary or like, you know, your gender just it doesn't really super matter. It's just not going to be there. It's not going to be available. We might not see changes in those languages. And we might not see changes in those languages for a variety of other reasons, considering that some of them are endangered. And revitalization does change languages, but it changes them in a little bit different language in a different way. So it'll be interesting to see how languages adapt to this sort of thing, if they adapt at all, because like we've said, in languages like Chinese, you know, they might have a different written way of distinguishing like male, female, non-binary, but they might just pronounce it the same because why would you need to pronounce it any differently if you're already pronouncing he and she the same?
Right. Yeah, it is super interesting. So I think we just did like a pretty broad dive, a pretty interesting discussion into lots of different aspects of grammatical gender. Is there anything else that you would add?
I don't think so. I mean, I think ultimately, like the takeaway that I kind of wanted from this topic was that grammatical gender is very interesting in terms of like how it functions within different languages, but it's not something to be inherently critical of. Because a lot of people, especially people that I've talked to, are super critical of gendered languages for being gendered and for, you know, having that as an aspect of their language in general. And it's not something that is inherently good or bad. It's just a complexity. And so that's
Mhm.
kind of like the takeaway I want everybody to get from this is that human language has complexity and it shows up in different ways. And some of those ways have some social weight to them. And so it kind of just depends.
Definitely. And there's native speakers of these languages that feel differently about it.
Mm-hmm.
There's not just one way that it's perceived, one way that it's used. Like there is a lot of complexity. And so, I think Stacey likes to say language is a tool. It's not
Yes.
inherently good or evil. There's pros and cons to having grammatical gender in a language, and languages are changing, they're constantly evolving. And so like they'll continue to evolve as society's values and perspectives change as well. So it's definitely a super interesting topic.
Yeah, and language and gender is also like is a very broad topic as well. So this is just like a very small part of a larger topic that I hope we can dive into in the future, because there's lots of different like sociolinguistic aspects of how gender and language are connected, and we can discuss those in another episode. But I think that this was a good introduction into gender and language in a very broad sense.
Yes, hopefully you all appreciated our many tangents and different examples. This is the For the Love of Paint link. Blah. Blah.
This is the For the Love of Language podcast. I'm Stacey the Linguist.
And I'm authentically EJ.
You can find us on For the Love of Language on Instagram, and you can find me, Stacey the Linguist, on Twitch, where we usually stream these podcasts when my computers are not broken.
We'll get there. It'll be great.
We'll get there. It'll be great. It'll be grand. Feel free to send us comments, send us questions. We're always happy to answer any language-related question. We eat it up like candy. It's delicious.
All right.
Take care of yourselves, friends.
Have a great day, everyone.